Do you know millions of Americans once had to pay a tax in order to vote? Poll taxes were a requirement to vote in many states. And it was not until the ratification of the 24th Amendment in 1964 that poll taxes became unconstitutional in the United States. So what were poll taxes, and where did they come from, and why did they finally end? Hi, I'm Evan Bennett, and I'm Professor of History at Florida Atlantic University and Director of the Voting Rights History Civic Literacy Project. And I'm here with 3 things you need to know about poll taxes and the 24th Amendment. 1. Poll taxes have a long history in the United States. Poll taxes date back to the colonial era. They were not created as a way to restrict voting, but as a way to collect a uniform tax from individuals in order to raise revenue. This was sometimes called a head tax. As late as the early 20th century, some states continued to collect some sort of poll tax from its citizens, usually as a way to support education. Paying a poll tax, however, was not usually a requirement to vote. In the years following Reconstruction, white political leaders in 11 southern states, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia all passed laws making payment of the poll tax a requirement to cast a ballot. These states did so primarily to exclude African American voters from the polls. When combined with other requirements designed to limit African American access to the polls, like literacy tests, poll taxes became another barrier to voting. The taxes, while relatively low, represented a significant expense for working people. This meant it also made it difficult for many white voters to cast a ballot as well. In 4 states, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and Virginia, the requirement that all unpaid poll taxes be paid made it even more expensive for poor people to vote. Requiring payment of the poll tax was not only exclusionary, it also opened the door to significant corruption. Some employers would pay the poll taxes of their employees with the expectation that the employees would vote in the ways that their bosses wanted them to. Other special interests would also pay people's poll taxes to ensure that the candidates they supported had enough voters. Politicians would sometimes pay people's poll taxes as well. Candidates who wished to challenge incumbents argued that poll taxes gave them an advantage and made it very difficult to change anything. They also argued that it gave special interests the ability to control the electorate. By the 1910s, some began to question the linkage of the poll tax and access to the ballot. Which brings us to 2. While the poll tax was not abolished until the 1960s, the movement to end it began much earlier. The first state to drop payment of the poll tax as a requirement to vote was North Carolina, which abolished the poll tax in 1920. In that state, it was the white voters of western North Carolina who led the charge to end it. They felt the poll tax gave an advantage to cotton and tobacco planters in eastern North Carolina and textile mill owners in the central Piedmont part of North Carolina, both of whom would pay the poll taxes of their workers in order to get them to vote as they wanted them. But North Carolina was an outlier. Other states held on tightly to the poll tax. It wasn't until 1934 that Louisiana ended its poll tax requirement, and Florida followed in 1937. Despite those victories, an attempt to have the poll tax declared unconstitutional in 1937 failed. In 1937, the case of Breedlove versus Suttles reached the Supreme Court. In that case, a Georgia voter challenged the constitutionality of that state's poll tax requirement. The court decided, however, that poll taxes were constitutional and that states could require their payment in order to vote. The Breedlove case sparked a movement to have the federal government place a ban on poll taxes. Reformers, most of them supporters of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, believed that eliminating the poll tax would open up support for the New Deal in the South. They created the National Committee to Abolish the Poll Tax, which then lobbied members of Congress and members of state legislatures to get rid of the poll tax requirement. In 1939, reformers were able to get a bill banning the poll tax passed in the House of Representatives, but members of the Senate blocked it. Senators from the southern states where the poll tax was still required used the Senate's rules of debate to filibuster the bill. They basically tied up the Senate by refusing to end debate on the bill. Supporters of the bill pushed for a motion for cloture to end debate and prompt a vote, but they failed, and they ultimately had to withdraw the bill so the Senate could get on to other work. Having failed to get a national ban on the poll tax, supporters were in 1942 able to get a measure into the Soldier Voting Act of that year that allowed soldiers and sailors to vote without paying the poll tax.
American citizen soldiers like these followed returns of their national election on many battlefronts. Months before, elaborate preparations had been made to deliver ballots to the front lines. His ballot came from Louisiana on the Gulf, and his ballot from New York. Millions of American ballots went to war so fighting men at home and overseas could help elect the leaders of their government. Voting is always secret, even at the front, and ballots go into sealed boxes. Election returns were listened to by Americans everywhere. These boys were in France. His candidate evidently won.
The years after World War II saw an expansion of anti-poll tax sentiment. In 1945, Georgia wrote a new constitution and left out the poll tax requirement. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman's Committee on Civil Rights called for an end to the poll tax in its landmark document to secure these rights. In 1951, South Carolina ended the poll tax requirement. Tennessee followed 4 years later in 1955. However, a second attempt to challenge the constitutionality of the poll tax failed in 1951. That year, the Supreme Court decided in Butler v. Thompson that the poll tax was not inherently discriminatory, despite the plaintiff's ample evidence that it was being used for that purpose. By the early 1960s, 5 states held on tenaciously to the poll tax requirement: Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia. In these states, political leaders believed that maintaining the poll tax was critical to their resistance to African American voting rights. But around the nation, the mood was changing. Despite the Supreme Court's decision in Butler v. Thompson, most Americans could see the discriminatory intent of poll tax laws. In 1962, Florida Senator Spessard Holland introduced the 24th Amendment to abolish poll taxes in all federal elections. Holland, a Democrat, had been encouraged by President John F. Kennedy to introduce the bill as a civil rights measure. Holland had opposed all other civil rights legislation, but he had long been an opponent of the poll tax. In fact, he'd worked in 1937 to end Florida's poll tax. Once introduced, the amendment passed the Senate 77-16. It then moved to the House, where it passed 295 to 86. The amendment was then sent to the states. It became part of the Constitution in January 1964 when South Dakota ratified the amendment. Most southern states refused to even vote on it. Mississippi voted against it. Nevertheless, with 3/4 of the states ratifying it, it became law. But 3. It took another Supreme Court decision to decide that the 24th Amendment applied to all, not just federal elections. As written, the 24th Amendment applies only to federal elections. This was done on purpose so that it would not appear that the federal government was reaching too far into state prerogatives. Spessard Holland knew that if the bill applied to all elections, some Southern moderates might not vote for it. In 1965, the federal government passed the Voting Rights Act, which included a ban on all poll taxes, but it was not clear that that was constitutional. In 1966, the Supreme Court took up a case challenging Virginia's law that voters still had to pay a poll tax in order to vote in state elections. The case, Harper v. Board of Elections, decided in favor of those who opposed the poll tax. In the case, the Supreme Court decided that poll taxes were inherently discriminatory and therefore violated the 14th Amendment. Chief Justice William O. Douglas explained, "Wealth or fee paying has no relation to voting qualifications. The right to vote is too precious, too fundamental to be so burdened or conditioned." Not all on the court agreed, but the majority of the court decided that poll taxes had no place in American elections. Poll tax requirements exist nowhere in the United States today, but some have argued that other burdens on voters, particularly voter ID rules that require state-issued identification, can serve as something like a poll tax on poor and working-class citizens, residents of rural areas, older Americans, and college students. The courts have yet to weigh in on this argument, however. Like the debate over poll taxes, it is a reminder that how we vote and what is required of citizens in order to vote are part of the often contentious process of our democracy in the United States.